DEC AltAC, do you know what AltAC means? It means alternatives to academia. This is a Twitter hashtag. And the reason why we organize those monthly meetings is that we realize that some people at DEC, perhaps even a majority, isn't going to pursue an academic career. And there are lots of alternative careers to academia that benefit from cognitive science and would benefit from you. So what we want to do is highlight all of the possible ways in which cognitive science can be useful outside of academia. Today, we have, sorry, and I want to highlight that students who are preparing the Diplôme de l'ENS will have the option this year of obtaining credit for attendance. So there's going to be no specific homework to do. Just by attending, you can get credit. Cami is going to check who's attending every meeting. And if you're interested in getting credits, you can just write me an email. So today we have two guests. Camille Lakhlifi did her master, the CogMaster actually, and she then went to work for the Direction interministérielle pour la transformation publique, where she applied cognitive science principles to have more efficient public policies. And now I think you did this for 2 years, right, Camille?
1 year and a half. It was like a 6-month internship and then 1-year agreement. Yes.
And after this, she decided that she would do a PhD, and she's now doing a PhD on a CIFRE funding. And her funding comes half from the Haute Autorité de Santé.
Full.
And
from Autorité de Santé. It's not exactly a CIFRE, but I will explain a bit more about this later. No problem.
So her path is very interesting because she got the same training as some of you guys, and she worked outside of academia, and now she's starting a PhD, which is really at the frontier between academia and applied policies, health policies. And Benjamin, who, as you can see from his white, what's the word, gown? No.
Coat. Coat.
Coat, is a doctor at the a real doctor, not like when we say we're doctors, like an actual doctor who saves people and stuff at the Pitié-Salpêtrière. And he does two things. One is fundamental research in the neuroscience of consciousness. And the other thing is trying to apply insights from cognitive science to understand when and why medical decisions are biased, which isn't reassuring to us patients, but he's going to explain how doctors make decisions and why they're biased by their own cognition, just like the rest of us. Okay. So yeah, I think you guys can start.
Cool, thank you, Coralie. Hi everyone. So I'm Benjamin Rohaut. I just show my face because it's always better to see people, I think. So I'm going to share my screen. I've prepared a few slides. So it's going to be a short talk, probably 15 minutes or so. Do you see my screen in full screen now? Okay. So I'm going to talk about decision-making and uncertainty. So this is the big picture, but more specifically, I will show you the example of the neuroprognosis of consciousness in the intensive care unit, because it's my basic research for many years. So intensive care unit is what we call in France réanimation, which is quite on the hype lately. And so I'm working at Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, as Coralie just said, in the neuro ICU of the neurological department of La Pitié-Salpêtrière. Here you have my email address if you want to contact me later. There is no problem. So I have no conflict of interest. And so why, just to give you the big picture, why we need to improve neuroprognostication of consciousness recovery in the ICU, because first, consciousness is frequently altered at the acute stage of brain injury, for instance, after a traumatic brain injury or a stroke, a cardiac arrest that can result in brain anoxia. And there are many cases like this when the patient doesn't wake up when we stop the artificial coma, the coma artificial, as we say in French, which is basically very close to general anesthesia that we may use, for instance, for super severe COVID patients that need vital support. We need to keep them anesthetized for sometimes several days. And when we stop the sedations, we expect the patient is waking up, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And the questions can arise that if the patients have any chance to recover consciousness, and should we continue the intensive care management. Because this recovery of consciousness can be delayed, there is some days when we have to raise those questions, and obviously the chance of recovery has a huge impact in medical decision, and especially to what we call withdrawal of life-sustaining therapies, which is basically when if you speak with colloquial language, is to unplug the patient because he has no chance to recover. Today, the withdrawal of life-sustaining therapies is one of the most common cause of death in ICU, because we have many techniques to sustain life, even for very sick patients. So how we can assess consciousness at the bedside when we examine the patients? So first we have the clinical exam, the neurological exam. I won't go through all the detail. I will just show you quickly one of the scale, which is now the gold standard, which is called the Coma Recovery Scale Revised, CRSR. But it's mainly basically based on the neurological exam, trying to probe non-reflex or intentional behavior that suggests that the patient is conscious. But this is not enough, and we have a lot of techniques based on neurophysiology or neuroimagery to probe directly into the brain activity, how much the patient is conscious, and how much the patient has chance to recover consciousness. So this is a clinical scale I just talked about, the Coma Recovery Scale Revised. So you see it's a basic scale with clinical items, and some of those items quote for minimally conscious states, which is better than vegetative states. So basically a patient in a coma has his eyes closed without any behavior when you stimulate the patient. If the patient just opened the eyes but without any signs of consciousness, we call this vegetative state, état végétatif in French, or état d'éveil non répondant, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, which is synonym. And if the patient has some behavior that suggests consciousness, for instance, visual pursuit, if the patient starts to track people in the room, or try to have a motor movement, try to, for instance, grab some object or try to interact with the external world, we call this minimally conscious, and those items here in green rate for this clinical state. And if the patient has a functional communication or is able to identify an object and to use the object on purpose, for instance, if you give the patient a tea brush and he show you how to use the object, we consider that this patient is conscious. So it's very basic, but this is the gold standard to assess consciousness at the bedside using only clinical exam. Among all the new techniques we have to explore consciousness based on the EEG, on fMRI, there are many techniques. Just show you this example. because it's a nice story, started more than 15 years ago by the team of Adrian Owen. Was a young patient after a TBI, diagnosed as in a vegetative state based on the clinical scale I just showed you. So the patient that was only able to open her eyes, was a woman without any more complex behavior. But when the scientist asked to the patients to perform mental task imagery, so for instance, a motor imagery, it was motor imagery that was to imagine playing tennis, they saw brain activity in a very specific brain area, which is supplementary motor area, which is involved in the programmation of complex movement. And this patient was only activating this brain area when she was asked to imagine playing tennis, and when the experimenter asked the patient to do nothing, the activity was decreasing, and so on and so forth. So there was a perfect correlation between the verbal command and the brain activity. And they used a second task, second imagery, mental imagery task, which was a visual, spatial visual imagery task. So they asked the patient to imagine moving into her house room by room, so visiting your home. And this mental task activates different brain area, and especially the parietal cortices and internal temporal cortices. And again, the brain activity was very correlated with the verbal command. Imagine you're visiting your home, stop. Imagine you're visiting home, stop, and so on and so forth. A few years later, in a second paper by the same team, they showed 10% of the patients in vegetative states were able to do this kind of task. And so it was 5 patients out of 50. And one of these 5 patients was able to use this to communicate. So they asked the patient some question about his life, the name of his children, or etc. And they told the patient to answer yes, imagine play tennis, to answer no, imagine visiting your home. And they were able to communicate with this quite complicated interface. So we now call this state dissociation, sorry, it's still in French, so cognitive motor dissociation, so dissociation cognitivo-motrice en français. And so this is a very state-of-the-art or very recent development of this science. So that was just to give you the big picture between the clinical and the bedside, which is available everywhere, and this kind of approach, which is very more recent, obviously. So on top of these 2 examples, extreme examples, the clinic and the very advanced brain imagery, there's a lot of other techniques based on EEG, based on in some cases on a blood sample, when we can have a marker of brain injury, and etc. We try to approach those patients with what we call a multimodal approach. The idea is to increase the degree of confidence, and it works when several independent markers are congruent. So if all the markers are bad, the brain is very damaged in imagery, the clinical exam is poor, the brain activity is very alterated, the diagnosis of consciousness is very unlikely, and the chance of recovery are very low. And at the opposite, if we have a lot of evidence of good brain functions and chance of recovery, the odds of recovery are high. So this multimodal approach, using several different techniques, each team have access to, is recommended now in many guidelines. This is a few examples of medical guidelines to how to assess those patients. But we know that there will always be situations where markers are incongruent. First, because none of these markers is very 100% sensitive and 100% specific. So we can have false positive, false negative. And sometimes we have in the worst case scenario, half of the markers saying like, okay, the brain activity is good and the patient should recover, and half of the markers that says the opposite. And in those kind of situations, we still have to make decisions, and we have to make decisions under uncertainty. And there is a huge literature, so I was not sure how much you are aware of this literature, but there is a huge literature in what is called behavioral insights that claims that under risk and or uncertainty, which is not exactly the same thing, but maybe Camille would say a word of that, our reasoning can be flawed or biased. And the question is how much in this kind of uncertainty, we doctors, caregivers, we can make wrong decision based on something else that the fact and the evidence that we should only count on. So this whole literature, scientific work has been recently popularized by Daniel Kahneman. You probably all, I hope, of this famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, in which Daniel Kahneman theorized a very simple model, system, what he called system 1, which is basically based on the heuristic. So it's very fast, unconscious, automatic cognitive process that help us in everyday decisions that usually are very, especially in doctor, if they are well trained, is quite precise and performant, but which is error prone. And one of the problems is like sometimes it's very difficult to detect that we make an error when we are using this kind of cognition. And at the opposite, he described what he called the system 2, which is a more conscious, steady cognition to try to assess the pros, the cons, what is the evidence, but it's way more effortful. And this is basically what we use when we do a complex decision. If you have to buy a house, I mean, you have to take the, where is the house? Is it large enough for my family and everything? And this kind of cognition is more reliable, probably less error prone, but it's very cognitive, I mean, it's very consuming in terms of effort. So this is just an example of the advantage of the heuristics, the system 1. That can spare our limited mental resource, to better predict the environment, etc. And so if we visualize a decision-making process using this sketch, here that would be an accurate decision. So each time you do the decision, you're right in the middle of the target. If you sometimes make errors, but not systematic errors, but you can have a noisy decision-making process. And if you do a systematic deviation about the right decisions, this is what we call the cognitive biases. And obviously, you can have both a noisy and biased decision process. So this is what we call the cognitive biases. So in the Kahneman and colleagues' literature, those cognitive biases have been studied mainly in economic and financial system, because there are a lot of data, and probably it's also I mean, a good way to popularize this science, because if you explain people that you do errors that makes you losing money, it's a good incentive to make people being interested to what you do. But recently, more and more people are investigating those cognitive biases in the medical field. In this field, probably, I mean, we can also lose money, but we can also make the patient's cases worse, and also have a health system not optimized, and maybe lose money in some way too, on top of losing maybe life. So there is this nice review done recently by Sapovnik, and he showed basically that the literature is very not consistent. You see, for instance, if you are interested in the framing effect, so the way you present some evidence to somebody can impact the way he understands it, and he will make a choice. It's basically the story of the glass half empty or half full. And you see here the prevalence of this cognitive bias in different studies, and it's super large. Basically, you can say nothing. And one of the problems is also many of the studies have been done not in ecological field, but on what we call case vignette. So it's basically an online survey when we present to caregivers a story of a patient, and you ask him to make a decision. But it's basically mostly like a game on an online survey. So it's probably not very a good example of what we see in real life. So to come back in my field, so making decisions for severely brain injured patients, if we simplify the problem, basically when we have the patients that don't wake up, we can be wrong predicting a good outcome. So we can have feel that the patient has a good chance to recovery and being wrong. And in that case, the patient can evolve towards a chronic vegetative state or severely disabled condition, which is not something we want. And at the opposite, we can be wrong, predicting a bad outcome. And in that case, it's different because usually if we predict a bad outcome at the acute phase of brain injury patients, we discuss, all the team all together, we discuss with the family, and usually we decide to stop the life-sustaining therapy and the patient dies. So obviously there is nobody wants to be wrong in either way, but there is as you can maybe see, what we can call an error asymmetry, because in that case, if you predict a good outcome and you're wrong, you will face your error. You will see that the patient is not wake up as you were expecting, and you will see that the patient is severely disabled. If you're wrong at predicting a bad outcome, there is no chance to see that you're wrong. And with a colleague from Columbia University, we try to see and to imagine how much the already known cognitive biases, confirmation bias, ability bias, etc. I won't go through the detail, but how much, can we imagine a scenario in which doctors and caregivers will be biased toward predicting a bad outcome? Because usually people doesn't like psychological or mental discomfort, and if there is a solution if you're wrong, you will be blind to your error. Maybe that could be a biased team toward a bad outcome. And in medicine, there's many other situations where the degree of uncertainty is high, especially today about what we call the triage. So it's the same word in English, and it's come from the French word. It's basically when you don't have enough beds or places in ICUs, and you have a huge surge of patients. At some point, you have to choose the patients that you're going to admit in the ICU, and the other will probably die. And in this situation, typically also it's probably at high risk of flawed reasoning and cognitive biases. And there are other family meeting, medical meeting, when you discuss and interact together, diagnostics challenge, therapeutic choice, etc. So on. I'm going to show you only one example in real life, or how much a very simple cognitive bias can have a huge impact in medicine. So this is a recent publication in one of the most prestigious medical journal. So in this study, the researcher from, I think it was Harvard and Columbia, explored 10,000 medical files of patients that had a heart attack and who need coronary artery bypass, graft surgery, so un pontage coronarien. in French. And they observed that the date of the anniversary of the patients had an impact of on the incidence of the indications of the surgery only when they passed 80s. So in US, usually doctors, when they talked about the patients, they say, oh, this is a male in his 70s or a male in his 80s. So they use this 80s way of speaking. In French, it's not so used. I mean, we usually we don't say that un patient dans sa quarantaine ou dans sa cinquantaine. Basically, we use the real age, but in the US, it's very frequent. And despite the fact that there is no recommendation at all, no guidelines that say that before IT you should do a coronary artery bypass graft surgery, and after IT you should not, the fact that the patient pass his anniversary date. So this is a comparison. This is the incidence of the surgery, the 2 weeks before anniversary of 80 years, and this is 2 weeks after. So basically, it's the same population, it's the same patients, but the incidence of the surgery is decreasing, and this this leads to a surmortality, to an increase in the mortality of the patients based on nothing, just based on the fact that they pass their anniversary. And this is called the left digit bias, so the tendency to categorize continuous variable on the basis of the leftmost numeric digits, which is basically the explanation why most of the price in the supermarket are like 4.90 euro rather than 5. Because when you see point for 99 euro, you see 4, and it seems cheaper than 5, even though the difference between 4.99 and 5 is very small. It's a kind of anchoring effect. You see this number first, and it looks smaller. So this, to date, I think the more impressive example of how just like absurd cognitive bias can change medical practices and have an impact on mortality. In our team, we to assess consciousness. So remember, we have this clinical tool, the Coma scale, that we can do at the bedside. We have also a very complex tool based on EEG, fMRI, as the example I show you. We also try to explore how much the feeling, the subjective feeling of the caregivers, the nurses assistants that take care of those patients, how much this is useful to assess the level of consciousness of the patients. And so this is another example of the application of behavioral insight literature. And this is, so it's not a cognitive bias, but it's a psychological phenomenon that is called wisdom of the crowd or collective intelligence. And this is based on the fact that if you ask one people to evaluate something that it's difficult to evaluate precisely, but he has a feeling of how much is it. So for instance, if you ask your friends, what is the distance between the Earth and the Moon? Most of the people doesn't know exactly the distance, but probably the error they're going to make will be distributed normally around the real value. And if you ask to enough people and you take the mean, basically you just make the error disappear. So we asked our nurses and nurses assistants in our medical team to evaluate the consciousness level of patients using a very simple visual analogic scale, and they were given their feeling between nothing, the patient is not here, there's nobody home, as the English people say, or normal, around 10, the patient is fully conscious. And when we did that, here in red, those patients, so each bar is a patient. Those red patients are vegetative patients based on the Coma scale revised, the first scale I show you, so based on the gold standard. And those patients are minimally conscious patients. And so the first thing you see is like if you take, for instance, this patient, each dot is an evaluation by a different caregiver. So there is a huge variability, as you can see, for one given patient among the different caregivers. And it's the same for all the patients. But if you take for any given patient the median of all the evaluations, you can see that you can almost perfectly separate, except those 3 patients here and those 3 patients here, you can separate the minimally conscious patients versus the vegetative state patients. So in other words, if you take the observations without no specific formations teaching, just ask the caregivers, do you think this patient is conscious and how much? And you get enough data, you can be as good or almost as good as a clinical scale dedicated to this assessment performed by a neurologist trained to assess consciousness. So this is an example of wisdom of the crowd. We call this wisdom of the caregivers. So to finish, so we think with Camille, and she will say she will talk more about that. If we have knowledge in medicine, but I mean, healthcare providers and many other fields, we think that if we have knowledge about all those caveats and pitfalls that can arise when we make decisions, we can maybe have a better warning system to alarm us that maybe we are doing a false reasoning, and we should maybe, for instance, split to system 2 rather than to keep track on system 1 if we want to refer to the Kahneman representations. Another approach to try to limit the errors is what we call the nudge, which has been developed by Richard Thaler and Cassius Staines, which is based basically on try to adapt the environment to try to limit the systematic errors that humans does. So the most simple example is the checklist in situations that if you forget something, you can crash your plan. So far, there's not, as far as I know, of people that working directly on the application of behavioral science in health system. There was one team in Harvard and one team in Penn University, but it's mostly operational structure to try to basically design nudges and mostly nudges in the hospitals. And there's no dedicated teaching so far for medical students. This is one of the projects of Cami to try to propose a teaching on medical students to see if this can increase their awareness and limit the cognitive biases in medical decisions. So this is a huge question: how much the teaching of this psychological phenomenon can limit and mitigate the effect of cognitive biases. I think that that would work, because if you know the existence of optical illusions, so you probably see a lot of optical illusion on internet if you're interested in neuroscience. And if you ask people to bet, to make a guess how much this table board is the same as this table board, you are aware that your visual system tell you that it's not the same. It's impossible that it's the same. But if you are aware about the existence of visual illusion, you won't probably bet like 1 million to say no, this is different. You will have some humility to say, I don't see them as the same, but I know that I can be tricked because my visual system it's not perfect. It's not just a passive camera that just observes the world. There is some processing of the information. And so if you have this knowledge, maybe you won't bet more than 10 euros, and you would be right, because it's exactly the same. And so to me, this is the best demonstration that I mean, teaching cognitive biases and behavioral science should at least improve a little bit the humility of people when they make decisions. So that's it. And thank you very much.
Thanks. So maybe thanks a lot. I forgot to mention that Benjamin agreed to give a talk after a whole night shift. So we very much appreciate that. So giving a talk under severe sleep deprivation, that was a great demonstration that it's possible. How should we do this, Camille? Should we have Camille speak? Camille, I hope you have a slightly shorter presentation. Otherwise, we're going to go off limit completely. Or should we ask questions to Benjamin first? What do you think, Camille?
Well, usually we do, if there's a pressing question in terms of clarification, we can have one now. But otherwise, maybe since Camille's going to touch on some of the subjects that Benjamin was discussing, we can move on to her presentation and then all discuss and ask her questions together.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's listen to Camille. And let's, Camille, if you could try and have a slightly more condensed.
Yeah, sure. I'm not like, this is going to be kind of a self-centered presentation. It's a little bit weird. Like, I'm going to talk about what I did and who I am and what I'm going to do. So it's a little bit like selfish, but I think that's
what we wanted.
Yeah, that's what. So when I was preparing, I was like, okay. So I think that's what I have been asked. So I'm going to do that. So there's a mini funny story about how I started to prepare this talk. So 1 week ago, I was like, okay, I'm gonna like talk about this and that and that. And first, usually you tell like who you are and what you did previously. Like I did a bachelor in biology and those kind of stuff. And then you get to the point like what I'm doing today. But then I had a conversation with Benjamin in the beginning of the week that was super interesting, and I thought I might share it with you because it gives an example of what we can do during my PhD project. So during a handover, so after a night shift in the hospital, Benjamin, you can correct me if I say bullshit, yeah? So in the end of the night shift, the night team goes away, and before it goes away, it gives all the information about every patient to the day team, right? So it's like a kind of very important information transmission time, and it can last for quite a long if you have like a lot of patients or if you had like a busy night shift or whatever. So it can be quite long. And so like we know that humans have some attentional limits, and I think doctor and caregivers are humans too. So it happens that sometimes maybe your like attentional level is not always the best, like after a lot of time of like talking and so on, and you know you're going to go through a long day and so on. So maybe the attentional level is not the best during the whole transmission. And so some researchers started to think like, okay, how can we make it the best? Like we know these are some like attentional limit, it's normal. How can we enhance the handover, so the information transmission moment, like for people to retain most of the information about like the patient we need to know very much information. So they developed a framework that is called IPASS. I didn't put the reference, and that's really bad. And I don't remember exactly the year of the paper, but it's quite recent. And they developed, so this is IPASS, a framework, and it gives like in which step you should say what about each patient. And the first one, the I, is illness severity. So you start your talk not by this is the patient, this is the age, this is so on, and you give the full story before you say, is it a really like super bad condition patient, or like if he's gonna go away in 2 days. You start by this so that, for example, if it's the patient which is in the worst condition of the service, you will catch attention of the caregivers, and so they will be like probably more full of attention for what you're going to say than if it's like a patient like we know he's going to go away tomorrow because everything is getting back to normal. And so I thought I might spoil you a little bit and talk first about a little bit of my project so that you can decide if it's worth listening to me in the end or not. So I'm going to work on the topic of investigating decision making on medical context. Then Benjamin talked a lot about it already, and we would like also to develop solutions to promote rational choices. And it's a co-supervision between Benjamin Rohaut and also Mehdi Khamassi, who is the study director of CogMaster that you may know. So it's kind of an applied topic, and Coralie was mentioning that it was a CIFRE. Actually, it's not a CIFRE. It changed a little bit, but it actually doesn't change my project at all. But we got fundings from High Health Authority, so the French National Health Authority. And it's not a CIFRE anymore for some kind of administrative stuff, but whatever, like I'm going to be employed by the ECM, so Brain Institute, thanks to the funding from High Health Authority. So it's kind of the same. And so Benjamin is in the Brain Institute and Mehdi is at ISIR. So he's more working on computational science and decision making. So it was like quite obvious that we're going to work on this. And I'm also in the FIRE doctoral school. It's a doctoral school from the Interdisciplinary Research Center. And like usually I think master students, when they go to a doctoral school, they go to ED3C. And so if you have any questions about another doctoral school, which is like the one of the CRI, please feel free to ask any question. I thought it's worth mentioning. So it's a kind of an applied topic. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more how I got there. So I started by a bachelor in biology, like studying organism, physiology, neuroscience and stuff, because I thought I'm going to do neuroscience master. But after digging, I realized that just slicing brains of mice and stuff are not exactly what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do is cognitive science, but it took me a while to understand that this discipline exists. And I joined the CogMaster. I took like courses like evolutionary psychology, reasoning, neuroscience and education, psychology and public policies. These were like, I realized I took as much as possible the applied courses. And then I did a pre-doctoral program for 1 year that doesn't exist anymore, but it was at PSL Technology and Innovation Institute. And it was like a science and entrepreneurship program. So it kind of teaches future doctors how they can implement what will be their research in the society in the business level, basically. And then I had for 1 year an agreement. So after an internship, I got a 1 year agreement in Direction interministérielle de la transformation publique. So it's like interministerial directorate for public transformation, something like this, in the behavioral science unit. I'm going to talk a little bit about this later. And now I'm starting my PhD. Also, I wanted to show you that my path was really not like straight at all. And I wanted to show you that like it's possible to find your way even by trying many different stuff. So I started by studying magnetoreception in planarian, which are super small flat worms in water. And if you cut them like in 2 or 3, it gives 3 worms. Like it's really different from humans. Then I studied a little bit mice. I did internships during the CogMaster. It's super cool because in CogMaster you can do a lot of like mini internships. So I discovered many things, such as coverable gestures during REM sleep in patients, and then neophobia towards food in young infants. So this is really not like a straightforward path. And my M2 internship was between SNCF and Neurospin, and it was about time perception across train traveling. So again, something new, some new topic. And then during my pre-doctoral program, I joined the behavioral science unit for an internship on behavioral science applied to public policies. Besides the studies, I took part in many kind of associations, events, and even personal activities, mainly on like focused on science popularization. So it started with connivence during my master, then a bit involved in the ACT lab, so ACT for approche comportementale, so behavioral approach for ecological transition, it's a transition écologique. It's still on, it's super cool, so if you want to join, feel free. Then I joined Chiasma too. So we, with Benjamin, we're part of Chiasma, which is a neuroscientist collective, let's say, and we're talking a lot about how we form opinions, how we can debate about our opinions, how we can make better choices by like learning how to doubt about ourselves and many things like this. Now I'm having a project with Efficience about critical thinking stuff, joining Fête de la Science, Semaine du Cerveau, and so on. So it took me also a lot of time to do those kind of stuffs. And sometimes during your studies, you kind of wonder, like, is it the good choice? Because some people are working and spending less time on those kind of activities. And sometimes I was like, maybe I'm not gonna have the best grades and this is gonna be pretty bad to get a PhD or to get a job I want. But actually it really helped me a lot. It's like kind of allowed me to meet some really awesome people with whom I could work. So this was quite a good idea for my experience, at least. And then I got this first job about behavioral insights for public policies, and I was a project leader in charge of the behavioral science community. So as I was doing a lot of science popularization before, and involved in many associations, like trying to federate all the people from cognitive science in France and those kind of stuff, we thought, okay, so that's cool, because maybe I can try to start in France a community for French public decision makers that do not know anything about behavioral insight but are interested. And my job was to kind of provide to those people some tools and organize events in order to like give them some knowledge, a little bit, some methods, or at least to give them a sense of why taking into account the behavior while you design public policies and why it's important to use scientific methods in order to evaluate their impact before you implement them at large scale is important. So that was my job. And yeah, that's it. Like, if you have any questions, we can discuss it afterwards for sure. And so what's the plan for now for my PhD project? Well, Benjamin talked a little bit about some kind of examples. So yeah, like I'm gonna rather show you my example. You had the table, so it's a visual illusion. I had rather a mathematical exercise. So a croissant and a candy costs at your favorite bakery €1.10 together. And the croissant costs €1 more than the candy. So the exercise, quite simple at first, is how much does the candy cost? And when you ask this to a huge amount of people, most people at the first thought answer 10 cents, which is actually impossible, because if the candy is 10 cents, it means that the croissant is €1.10, which is €1.10 plus 10, which means altogether they would be €1.20. So the real answer is the candy costs 5 cents and the croissant €1.05, which is altogether €1.10. This is just an example to see, like, to give you a sense that even some like students with like long curriculum in university and stuff, they kind of still have this heuristic of, yeah, first answer is 10 cents. And it's actually not so far from the good answer, but it's not the good answer. And the point is that, yeah, like in doctors in are humans. Yeah, I told that already. And sometimes they face decisions in like a high, like a situation where there's a high uncertainty, and like those heuristics might have an impact, and cognitive bias indeed might have an impact on the decision they take. It can be bad or it can be actually good. There is like in the literature a kind of debate that maybe heuristics in a high level of uncertainty is like the best you can do. Actually, it's like, it's called the rule of thumb. You do like with your nose, with your intuition, because actually you don't have so many information to guide your choice. There's a big difference, and Benjamin was talking a little bit about this, between risk, so decision under risk, and uncertainty. Risk is when you actually have all the information to make the calculation of how risky is your decision. Like, what is the probabilities you're going to get this and or this, I don't know, like outcome. And uncertainty, sometimes you don't even know all the outcomes that can occur, or you know them, but you don't know the associated probability and you cannot calculate them. And so, yeah, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. For example, while you're on a night shift and you receive a call, so it's the topic of triage that Benjamin was mentioning before. You have, for example, 2 free beds in your unit, and you have to decide when you get a call whether you're going to give the bed to this patient or not, without knowing how many calls you're going to have and which patient you're going to be asked to take in your unit during the rest of the night, which is a high level of uncertainty. And for example, we can imagine that the first patient you get called for will influence whatever the answer you give for the next calls you're gonna have. So for example, if the next call, the patient is younger, you might be influenced just by the call you had previously without any consideration for like the age. Let's say you got kind of anchor bias by the age of the first patient, sorry. So we're going to wonder, like, what is the prevalence and impact of irrational medical decision-making and in real life? Irrational is to take like smoothly, because like under uncertainty, it's not always easy to know what is rational and what is not. But like what leads to most errors? How does it work? So which is the situation which gives the most errors? Is it during night shifts? Is it when you're alone? Is it like, there are many things to investigate, and what solution can we develop to mitigate errors? And this is really connected to my previous job about developing solutions and testing their impact to see if they work or if they're not useful at all, or even if they make things worse, which is possible. And we have for this an interdisciplinary approach. So it's going to be experimental psychology. We're going to dig also into a lot of data sets. We're going to do a little bit of computational modeling, and we're going to use applied behavioral insights. And I wanted to give you, before we can discuss all of this, some tips for a happy pro-life. Yay, this is my own recipe, so don't take it as like this. But so how I got there is actually because during my first year of CogMaster, Mariam Chamat, who is part of Chiasma and who's working in the Behavioral Science Unit, came during, I don't remember the name, but it's like a day in CogMaster where people come and talk about what they did basically and how they get to where they are, how we're doing it like today. And she talked about what she was doing. And I was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. And that's the kind of people I want to work with. And well, here I am, so I'm super lucky. And I thought, like, at this moment, I was so lost. I didn't know at all what I want to study. I was taking like many different internships and stuff. So it was absolutely unclear. And I wish someone could give me some tips. So here are mine. So be aware of your, it's going to look like a crappy list of like self-help coaching stuff, but I couldn't make it better. So be aware of your own skills, meaning in research and, for example, during your studies, you don't always get to realize what skills you're developing. But for example, for people who are out of research, going on Google and checking if someone already had their idea before they had is not natural at all. So doing like a kind of review or checking the benchmark of what has been done before you start a project is not something everybody does. So this is already a skill. Critical thinking is a skill. You know how to read super complex papers and how to criticize them. This is a huge skill that not everybody has. If you're nice or funny, that's also a skill, and it's cool. So don't forget all of this. And even like some skills you can develop in associations and stuff, they can become kind of your job afterwards. So that's cool. Don't forget this. Don't be afraid to try new stuff. Like if you try some internship and you don't like them at all, cool. You know that you don't want to do that and you don't want to work with those people. It happens and it's still cool. And when you like something or when you like someone, who does something, just don't keep it always like, yeah, in 2 years when I'm going to go be ready, I'm going to go to this person and so on. Just go talk, ask for internship, ask for, I don't know, like join the association, join the stuff and so on. Spam people. No, don't spam, but like go and talk. It's really, it helps a lot. Extra activities are often a good way to start. That's what I was talking before. And work with people you appreciate and admire. So that's one of the advice Mariam told me, and I think it's one of the best advice I got. Like, choose people you want to work with because you appreciate them and you want to build a project with them. Even sometimes you might like meet people you really admire and appreciate, but they are not working exactly on what you wanted to work on. But sometimes it's a better idea to go with them and develop your project with them than to go in an unknown lab super far away with people you don't know and have like a really tough PhD. For example, I got to meet some people in the doctoral school, and sometimes I'm a bit worried because they don't know at all their team, and they get step by step to realize how tough their supervisors are, for example. And this is quite scary when you know that you're going to have 3 years to spend in this. And also what I really like, and this is maybe because I was working before I started my PhD, but I really see my PhD as my own first, like second job. First, I'm not like getting back to studies. It's my first research job, and it's my own first research project. So you don't have to apply to already done and prepared topic. It's harder to build one, that's true, but if you like very much something and like some topic and you find some people who are willing to supervise you, well, like go for it, develop it, and then you're gonna hopefully get fundings. This is a super long quest, but it's possible. Yeah, and I guess that's all. And we can discuss, that's the good part.
All right. Well, thank you so much for
Cami, we don't hear you so much, I think, with the earphones. So
okay.
Sorry.
This is better?
Yeah, way better.
Okay. I said thank you so much for these two presentations. We don't have that much time for questions, but we do have a little time. So if you have any, please feel free to unmute yourself and then ask a question.
Also, we can give our emails address and you can talk afterwards, or for me on Facebook, LinkedIn, and those kind of stuff. I'm easy to reach. So,
any questions? Otherwise, I have one to open the floor. All right, so it seems as though, so for your PhD project and even what Benjamin was showcasing is that you're going to be using a lot of what you know about cognitive biases to create some tools that then can be implemented in the healthcare system. And so I was wondering, maybe based on your experience, like applying other tools to other disciplines or in general in the medical system, do you think it's something that's very hard to do to, you know, apply your findings and create tools and then implement them? Is this a really long process?
So we're super lucky in this because the project is funded by the High Health Authority. So it means that they are interested in the outcome of our research, and probably it means that they're willing to implement it at a big scale. This is really cool. Because if you develop it in a lab, for example, and then you have to prove that it works and so on, it's much more complex. But now they're with them in the team since the beginning, and we're gonna obviously narrow the topic. This was quite like wide what we presented, but we're gonna narrow it with them to be sure that we answer an actual really like big problem. And they seem very interested to like take into account what we're gonna produce here. So implement our tool if we develop some that show good efficiency, but sometimes it can be quite hard. It really depends with whom you're working and with the authority that has like that they have. It's very depending on on the situation, for example, usually what you can see is that local, I'm rather talking about my experience from my previous job, but local cities and regions, and they're much more willing to participate in developing such tools and to implement them, because it's at a smaller scale. When you get at a bigger scale, you have to contact many different people, convince them one by one, and it takes quite a lot of time.
And for maybe to complete what Cami said, from the clinical point of view, I expect, because we are talking about doctors and French people, so let's say French doctors, maybe for instance, the example Camille showed you is IPAS, so the mnemonic to try to standardize the handover. So this is typically has been developed in the US more than 10 years ago. It's like mandatory for trainees, for young doctors to be trained to those techniques to make formalized, standardized handover. It has been shown that this reduced dramatically the medical errors, like something like 30%. This is super huge. And I just discovered that like a few months ago in France, reading papers. I mean, we have no education at all about that. It's just everybody is like just learning on the during the job, basically but it's very and we know already when people try to implement, for instance, just simple checklist in clinics, in medicine, it's usually people, it's probably because I don't know, we French doctor doesn't like obligations, right? So, but for some specialty, for instance, in anesthesia, because at some point people observed like a dramatic accident with people that basically died, they obligated people to do some checklist at the beginning of the general anesthesia and stuff like that. And now it goes slowly into the field, but it's very difficult. But the good point is behavioral science can also help to facilitate the application of this kind of approach. So for instance, one of the idea would be if we teach young doctors about all these psychological caveats, even though they don't feel exactly what their interest is at this point for their own practice, maybe we can expect like a few years later when people will come to say, okay, you have to use a checklist in this situation because people are crappy and do a lot of error. Maybe they will say, okay, thanks, because I know that it's possible. I don't feel like you think I'm dumb and I'm gonna do errors. And so this is obviously an open question, but I think that could help to design solution and also to facilitate the acceptation of solutions, maybe. I hope.
And when you evaluate the impact of some tool you develop, if it proves to be efficient, it's really cool also because you have numbers to show, like here we created this, here is like what you can get, like the money you can save, the lives you can save and stuff. And this helps too. So it's cool because it's evidence-based, but it's also cool because it helps to implement it.
All right.
Can I go?
Yeah.
Yes, it's sort of a meta question. You know how in neuropsychology, you say that the first step in curing people is to, la levée de l'anosognosie is to lift anosognosia. Do you feel like there is such a problem with doctors that they just do not realize that they are that biased and that actually the first step is that one, is that lifting that bias of not wanting to accept that you're error prone? And I have a specific example in mind, which is the checklist du bloc opératoire. So it's a checklist that surgeons are supposed to use to make sure that you know, they don't amputate the wrong side of somebody's body, for example. And this this checklist exists in France, and the issue is that, from what I understand, one of the biggest issues is that doctors do not want to use it, and they fake their use because they're required by law to use it. But sometimes they fill out the checklist after the operation, you know, like they fill out 20 checklists in one go at the end of the day. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's close to what I discussed earlier. I mean, I think if the people are not aware about the risk of error, and they have this kind of overconfidence about their own skills, I mean, it's probably difficult to accept to use a cognitive aid that we can. Checklist is I mean, some way a cognitive aid, right? And it's kind of funny. I mean, I don't remember exactly the study, but there is some. I'll show you this paper about the psychological traits, for instance, in terms of overconfidence or certainty and so on, among the different medical specialties, and with probably difficult to tell if it's a causality, causal relation, or because, for instance, you're very you have no doubt and you think you are the better. Maybe you are maybe prompt to go into a specialty with a high risk, and if you do something wrong, the patient can die in a few minutes, for instance, in cardiac surgery or stuff like that. One could say, okay, if you have too many doubts about everything you're doing, you're basically paralyzed. You can do nothing. If you're thinking about all the pros and cons and so on, at the opposite, if you think you're the best surgeon ever, the humanity is probably like in some ways maybe something like we can see in presidents. If you think you're the best president ever in the whole humanity, it's okay. You can run the United States even though you're not obviously the best one. but I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, is whether your initial personality traits drives you to this specialty or more quiet specialty when you have time to reasoning and to discuss with your colleague and so on, or if there is a kind of adaptative phenomenon that at some point, if you start to do this job when you have to make decisions that can basically are life or death decisions, you have to change maybe your way, the way you're thinking, otherwise you can just don't work, right? It's kind of maybe of cognitive dissonance resolutions. At some point, if you feel you're not good enough, you should quit this practice. And to stay in this practice, you have to think you're the best. Maybe, I don't know, but I think it's interesting, and it's probably it's funny that to my knowledge, for instance, in the operating room, the anesthesiologists are more prone to do checklists and to apply checklists than surgeon, and they work in the same place, right? So, kind of.
But it's super interesting to know who you're going to target in which way.
Yeah.
Also, like how you're going to approach them.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, is there one last short question? Because if not, then I invite you to maybe ask more questions by emails if you do, and otherwise I think we're going to close the session for today. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. And our next event is going to be next month. You can find our program online by simply going to writing DEC AltAC and then go on the DEC website. We have a whole list of speakers in our program. Thank you again, Benjamin and Camille, for your presentation. And I'll let you know when I put the recording online.
Cool. if I can say the last word,
of course, please.
Take care and download the new Stop COVID app. It's gonna help us.
Yeah. All right. Let's help Benjamin.
Bye bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a nice day.